Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into Madhyamaka Buddhism, something I'm sure many of you, especially those of you interested in philosophy, have at least heard of before. Emptiness, the middle way, all that jazz. But today we're going deep into its development in India between the 5th and 8th centuries.
A really dynamic period, yeah.
Really dynamic. Tons of debate, tons of back and forth. And we're going to be looking specifically at some of the key arguments and how they evolved over this time.
Really interesting stuff. Looking at how the Madhyamaka school, one of the major schools in Mahayana Buddhism in India, alongside the Yogacara school, grappled with these ideas and really staked its claim on that idea of the middle path, the Madhyama Pratipad.
Right. And it's important to remember that this middle path isn't some sort of like compromised position.
No.
It's a total rejection of those extremes like eternalism.
Right. Eternalism, that idea that there's some unchanging substance to reality.
Yeah. Or, on the other hand, annihilationism.
The idea that things just cease to exist, completely, without any underlying reality.
Right. So for a philosopher, like right off the bat, that's like, okay, what are we even standing on here? What grounds this middle? What's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. What's the foundation for this middle path?
So what do they say? I mean, how do the Madhyamikas sort of ground this middle way?
Well, they argue that this middle way, it's found by denying svabhava.
Okay, svabhava, inherent nature.
Yeah, inherent nature. Denying that inherent nature exists in any phenomena whatsoever. And it's not that things don't exist conventionally, obviously. We experience things. But it's the idea that things lack that sort of intrinsic independent nature.
Oh, okay.
And so that leads us to that really foundational concept of Madhyamaka sunyata, or emptiness.
Oh, emptiness. Yeah, that's a big one.
It's a big one. And the insight here, and why it's so central to this whole discussion, is that our deeply ingrained belief in things having a fixed, independent self-nature, that's actually what creates our suffering.
Ooh, I see.
So by understanding emptiness, we start to kind of dismantle that illusion, see it for what it is. And this whole concept is deeply tied to the perfection of wisdom literature, something that comes up again and again in our sources.
And I think one thing that might be helpful for people to understand, because a lot of times people hear emptiness and they immediately jump to nihilism.
Yeah.
But it's not saying things don't exist.
Right.
It's more about the way in which they exist.
Exactly. The way in which they exist, not independently, but dependently.
Right. So it's not saying there's no cup in front of me.
Right.
It's saying that the cup in front of me doesn't exist inherently on its own.
Precisely.
It exists in relation to everything else.
Yeah, dependently. Like, dependent on its causes, its parts, the person perceiving it, naming it cup.
Right. It's all interconnected, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
So to kind of navigate this philosophical landscape, what are some of the key texts that you think are going to be helpful for our listeners?
Well, there are a couple that really stand out as foundational to the whole Madhyamaka system. Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika.
Mula Madhyamaka Karika.
Yeah, often just called the MMK.
The MMK, easy enough.
And his Vigrahavyavartani.
Vigrahavyavartani.
Yeah, which is often just shortened to VV.
VV.
Right.
Okay, cool. So we got the MMK and the VV.
Exactly. And these texts, they sparked so much debate, so much further exploration, and they really shaped Buddhist thought, not just in India, but later on in China and Tibet as well.
Right. Yeah, massively influential works. And so for this deep dive, we're looking at a really specific period, right? Like we said, the 5th to 8th centuries.
Right.
Where we see this initial framework that Nagarjuna kind of laid down, really getting interrogated.
Yeah, rigorously analyzed, debated, picked apart.
Right. Tons of intellectual activity going on.
Tons of it.
And the sources we looked at highlight some pretty key issues at the forefront of all this.
Yeah.
Issues that I think any philosopher, whether they're Buddhist or not, are going to find really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these are core philosophical issues, the kind that we all wrestle with.
Totally. So what are some of those core issues?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is the doctrine of the two truths.
Okay, the two truths.
Yeah, the conventional truth, or Savati Satya, and then the ultimate truth, or Paramartha Satya. And a lot of the debate is about how those two truths relate to each other.
Right. What is their relationship? How do they fit together?
Exactly. And then there's that classic philosophical problem of language. I mean, can our words, our concepts, can they ever really grasp something that's said to be beyond concepts? Like nirvana.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one.
And then finally, there's the whole question of logic and argumentation within Madhyamaka.
Okay, so different viewpoints within the school itself about how to use logic how to argue.
Exactly. And how those methods relate to other schools, like the Yogacara school.
Gotcha. So let's dive into that first layer, early Madhyamaka and this idea of denying inherent nature. So we've talked about it a little bit, but I think it would be helpful to kind of go back to svabhava, inherent nature. Like when we say something lacks inherent nature, what are we saying about how it exists? What's this mode of existence?
Right. Yeah, that's key. So svabhava, like we've touched on, it signifies this intrinsic self-sustaining existence.
Huh?
Like a thing has this property that it just possesses all on its own. It doesn't depend on anything else. Like it's independent of any causes, conditions, anything outside of itself.
Gotcha. So to say that something is empty of svabhava, to say it lacks that inherent nature, is to say that its existence is always contingent.
Yes.
It's relational,
Yes.
It arises depending on other factors.
Exactly. It's dependent arising all the way down.
Right. So it's not like it has this sort of like fundamental bedrock that it's standing on.
No, not at all. And the early Madhyamaka project, especially with Nagarjuna, it was really a project of critique.
Okay, so it was about critiquing other views rather than like putting forward their own positive system.
Yeah, more about deconstruction than construction in a way. So instead of saying, okay, here's emptiness, here's our positive metaphysical system all about emptiness, he's looking at these other philosophical viewpoints, these other positions that posit these inherent natures, and he's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense.
Right, so he's pointing out the inconsistencies in those views.
Exactly. Like, look at the contradictions here. If things have this inherent nature, then how can they change? How can they be dependent on anything?
Right.
You see, it just doesn't hold up.
Gotcha. And this brings us to Aryadeva, who's often considered like a direct disciple of Nagarjuna, right?
Yeah, that's right. Active around the 3rd century CE.
Okay. And his major work, the Kaktushataka, which means the 400-verse treatise.
Yeah, 400-verse treatise.
He seems to really take this critical methodology and kind of like extend it, apply it even further.
He does. And I think what's really insightful in his work is how he turns the critical lens on some of the really fundamental human illusions. Like the first 100 verses in the Katushataka, they systematically tackle our beliefs in permanence, in the idea that we can find real satisfaction in impermanent things, that we can find satisfaction in things that are impure,
Yeah.
And this idea that we have this fixed, independent self.
Classic Buddhist themes for sure.
Absolutely, but he approaches them with this really rigorous philosophical argumentation. It's not just, this is what the Buddha said. He's giving you reasons, arguments, really breaking it down.
Right. And then he takes those next 200 verses and he shifts gears a little bit, right?
He does. He moves towards those positive ethical qualities like altruism and virtuous conduct. But at the same time, he's still engaging with and refuting those specific doctrines of all these different schools, right? Like various Brahmanical schools, other Buddhist philosophical systems.
Right. So he's taking on the different schools of his time.
Absolutely. Engaging in that lively philosophical debate that was happening in India at the time.
But the method is consistent, right?
Yeah.
Even though he's talking about ethics now, he's still using that same approach of pointing out the incomprehensibility or the absurdity of the other viewpoints.
Exactly. He's not letting up on that critical lens, you know? He's showing how these other views, when you really examine them, they just don't hold water.
So it wasn't about like winning arguments or proving his own point.
No, not at all. I think, and this comes out really clearly in his work, it was more of a therapeutic project.
Interesting.
Yeah, he wanted to help people loosen their grip on these tightly held beliefs.
I see.
To show them that clinging to views, to your own position, is actually an obstacle to liberation.
Right. Yeah, it's that attachment that's the problem.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important insight for anyone doing philosophy. It's not just about building these big, elaborate systems. It's about how those systems are impacting our lives, how they're shaping the way we see the world, and ultimately how they might be holding us back from freedom.
Right, like what's the point of it all if it's not leading to some kind of liberation?
Exactly.
So there's a really cool example that our source mentions of how Aryadeva uses this approach to critique the idea of a permanent self.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Like if the self was really permanent, he argues, that it would be totally impervious to harm or destruction.
Right, yeah, because how could something permanent and unchanging be harmed? It wouldn't make any sense.
Right, so then those ethical rules against causing harm, they kind of become meaningless.
Exactly. If you believe in a permanent self, then these ethical guidelines just don't hold up logically.
So it's a really clever way to expose this tension within that philosophical framework.
Absolutely. He's really hitting at the core of the issue there. And, in the 14th chapter, the Katishaka, he actually lays out a more formal paradigm of argumentation that becomes really characteristic of Madhyamaka thought.
Okay, interesting. What's that about?
It's this method of systematically going through the possibilities, attributing a predicate to a subject, then its negation, then both, then neither.
Oh, okay.
And he shows how each of those options leads to problems.
So like classic example, the pot, right?
Exactly, the pot. So you can argue that the pot isn't truly single because it's made up of parts.
Right.
It's got a shape, it's got a color.
All these different characteristics.
Exactly, but then you can't really say that it's multiple pots either.
Right, because none of those individual parts are the pot itself.
Exactly. So if you try to say, okay, it's both single and multiple, or it's neither single nor multiple, you just run into more and more problems.
Right, you get tangled up in the logic.
You get tangled up, exactly. And ultimately, what this does is it pushes you to question this whole idea of the pot having this inherent singular identity.
Right, like what even is a pot?
Exactly. And it's this relentless unpacking of these seemingly simple concepts that's really at the heart of early Madhyamaka.
So it's really more about the questions than the answers.
Yeah, it's about showing how our usual ways of thinking about things, they don't quite capture reality.
Right, it's like shaking up those assumptions, those foundational beliefs that we have.
Exactly. And one thing that's interesting about Uryadeva is that he does all this with such an economy of language. His verses are very concise.
Oh, really? So it's dense?
Yeah, super dense. Often you need those later commentaries to really unpack everything that's going on there.
Oh, to like tease out the meaning.
Exactly. To fully appreciate the depth of what he's saying.
So that brings us to Buddhapalita, right?
Yes.
Active in the late 5th, early 6th century.
Yeah, that's right.
And he wrote the Madhyamaka Vuti, which is the earliest commentary we have on the MMK, right? On Nagarjuna's work.
Yeah, the earliest surviving one.
So does he kind of continue in that same critical spirit as his predecessors?
He does, very much so. Buddhapalita's commentary, like the MMK itself, it's not putting forward some positive thesis.
Okay.
It's more about taking these philosophical questions, really dissecting them, and showing that all the solutions people come up with, they're just untenable.
Right, so it's like deconstructing the answers, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And his main method is what's called the prasanga method, where you demonstrate all these unwelcome logical consequences that come from holding a particular position.
So it's like, okay, you think this is the case.
Right.
Well, if that's the case, then this absurd thing happens.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's like, look at all these problems that arise if you hold this view.
Gotcha. And our source mentions a classic example, the relationship between cause and effect, right?
Oh, yeah, the very first verse of the MMK.
MMK 1.1.
Yeah, super famous verse. And Buddhapalita, he just goes through all the options. He's like, okay, maybe cause and effect are identical.
Right.
Maybe they're completely different.
Right.
Maybe they're both. Maybe they're neither. And he shows how each of those options leads to problems.
So, like, if cause and effect are identical, then why would you even need causality?
Exactly. Right. It becomes redundant.
And if they're completely different, then anything could cause anything.
Precisely. You could have, a rabbit giving birth to an elephant.
Right. Total chaos.
Chaos, exactly. And the other options, they don't fare much better.
So it's like a systematic dismantling of our whole idea of how cause and effect work.
Absolutely. And this has some pretty big implications, especially for Buddhist practice.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, if there's no real reliable connection between our actions and their consequences, then what's the point of ethical conduct?
Right.
What's the point of meditation?
Like, why bother?
Right. Why bother? If there's no causal connection, then you can't really say that practicing virtue leads to happiness or that negative actions lead to suffering.
It undermines that whole system of ethics and practice.
It does. It really does.
But it seems like this purely critical approach, this non-assertive approach, it didn't go unchallenged within Madhyamaka.
No, not at all.
Our source mentions that some critics, they argued that just pointing out the flaws in other views without offering something positive, something constructive, it wasn't really satisfying.
Right. It's like, okay, you've torn everything down.
Yeah, now what?
What do we build in its place?
Exactly.
And that's where Bhava Viveka comes in.
Bhava Viveka, okay.
Mid-6th century. And he marks this huge turning point in the development of Madhyamaka.
How so? What's his big contribution?
Well, he wrote this really important commentary on the MMK called the Pratyabhadipa.
The Pratyabhadipa.
Yeah, the Lamp of Wisdom. And he also wrote this independent work, his magnum opus, the Madhyamaka Karika.
The Madhyamaka Karika.
Which means verses on the heart of the middle way.
Okay, verses on the heart of the middle way.
And that one has a commentary called the Tarkavala.
The Tarkavala.
Yeah, the flame of reasoning. And the key difference with Bhavaviveka is his conviction that Madhyamikas, they should be putting forward a positive philosophical position.
Oh, okay, so a break from that earlier approach.
Yeah, a real shift. He's saying, look, we're not just critics. We actually have a view. We believe in emptiness, and we need to defend it.
Right, so emptiness isn't just the absence of inherent nature.
Right.
It's like a positive claim about the way things are.
Exactly. And Bhavaviveka, he thought that Buddha Palita's method, just relying on the prasanga, it amounted to what was called vitat in Indian philosophical debates.
Vitanket.
Yeah, which is basically just destructive criticism. Like, you're just tearing things down without offering anything of your own.
No.
And he's like, no. We actually have a belief. All phenomena are dependently arisen. They're empty of inherent existence. And we need to argue for that.
Right, and he's got reasoning behind it.
He does. And to support his position, he actually goes and adopts the logical framework developed by Dignaga.
Okay, Dignaga, another big name.
Yeah, a big name in Indian logic. So he incorporates these standard elements of a valid inference, the subject, the reason, the property to be established.
So he's formalizing the argument.
Exactly, yeah. He's bringing in this formal logic to really solidify his position.
Interesting. And our source also talks about how he interprets those negations in the first verse of the MMK.
Oh, yeah. Those are really interesting. He argues that they should be understood as sentential negations.
Okay, sentential negations.
So instead of just negating the predicate, like saying things do not arise from themselves, he's negating the entire proposition. Like, it is not the case that things arise from themselves.
Okay, so it's a subtle distinction.
It is, but it's philosophically super important.
Yeah, I mean, what's the difference?
Well, if you just negate the predicate, right? If you just say things do not arise from themselves, you might still be implying that there is this thing, this phenomenon that doesn't arise from itself.
Oh, okay, I see.
You're still kind of trapped in that framework of inherent existence. But when you negate the whole proposition, you're calling into question that entire framework.
So you're saying it's not even possible for something to arise from itself.
Right, exactly. You're rejecting the very possibility of inherent arising.
Oh, interesting. And so Bhavaviveka, he sees Nagarjuna's ultimate aim as establishing this kind of non-conceptual cognition, right?
Yes, this direct, intuitive understanding that goes beyond language and concepts.
Right, like beyond words.
Exactly, but he also believes that language can be used skillfully. It operates within the realm of conventional truth, but it can still point towards ultimate truth.
Okay, so it can kind of like gesture towards that which is beyond words.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, for example, we can talk about emptiness. We can talk about the emptiness of inherent existence.
Even though it's ultimately beyond concepts.
Exactly, yeah. We can use language to kind of get a handle on it.
Interesting. And he also makes this distinction within the highest goal. The Paramartha Tatya, right?
He does. He talks about two aspects of it. One that's completely free from any kind of thought.
It's a pure, unadulterated experience.
Yeah, just pure experience.
No concepts.
No concepts at all. And then another aspect that's more volitional, connected to knowledge and karma.
Okay, so like that's the part that engages with the world.
Exactly. The part that allows us to act, to make choices.
So it's like there's this ultimate reality that's beyond everything, and then there's this aspect of it that kind of like interfaces with our everyday experience.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And he uses this great metaphor of a ladder.
A ladder.
Yeah, he says those verbal teachings, they're like a ladder. You climb up the ladder step by step until you reach that non-conceptual realization of nirvana. And then once you reach that point, you don't need the ladder anymore.
You kick it away.
You kick it away.
You're free.
Exactly.
So it's like a tool to get you there, but it's not the thing itself.
Precisely, yeah.
But again, Bhavaviveka's approach, this more assertive, argument-driven approach. It didn't just, everyone was like, okay, cool, that's it, we're done. There was more back and forth, right?
Oh, yeah, always more back and forth in philosophy.
Of course.
So we get Candrakirti, who's coming onto the scene in the early 7th century, and he's a huge defender of Buddhapalita's approach, that purely critical method. And he's not a fan of Baba Viveka's innovations.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He thinks it's a mistake to try and put forward those independent arguments for emptiness.
Interesting. And what are some of his key works?
Well, he wrote this really important commentary on the MMK called the Prasanapada Madhyamaka,
The Prasanapada Madhyamaka.
which is, the clear words commentary. It's a real mouthful.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
And then he also wrote his own independent treatise called the Madhyamaka,
The Madhyamaka,
which is entering the middle way.
Entering the middle way. Okay.
Yeah. And those works, they're really central for understanding this whole other side of the debate within Madhyamaka. And actually, his work is what led to that Tibetan scholastic division of Madhyamaka into two schools.
Two schools.
Two schools, yeah. The Svatantrika school, which is attributed to Baba Viveka,
Right.
because of his emphasis on using those independent arguments.
Right. The Svatantra.
And then the Prasangika school, which is associated with Candrakirti,
Sathagika.
because of his emphasis on those prasanga arguments.
Gotcha. The unwelcome consequences.
Exactly. So you've got these two main branches of Madhyamaka in Tibetan Buddhism stemming from this debate.
That's really interesting. And so Candrakirti is really doubling down on this idea that Madhyamakas shouldn't be advancing their own positive claims.
He is. Like, he often quotes Nagarjuna himself, from the Vigrahavya Vartani, where Nagarjuna says he doesn't have a thesis.
Right.
He's not putting forward anything.
He's got no dog in this fight.
Exactly. And Candrakirti loves this.
And he quotes Orideva too, right?
He does, yeah. Rayadeva says that someone who doesn't make any claims, well, you can't refute them.
Oh, that's clever.
Right.
Right.
If you're not putting forward a position, then how can anyone attack it?
You're unassailable.
Exactly.
So Candrakirti, he sees Buddhapalita's, his avoidance of those formal arguments as this really wise move.
Yeah. It's like Buddhapalita knew what he was doing.
Strategic silence.
Strategic silence, exactly. And Candrakirti's argument is that this is the only way to really stop these endless philosophical disputes.
Right, because if you're not making a claim, there's nothing to argue about.
Precisely. And he thinks the whole point of Madhyamaka is to bring an end to that kind of fixed position taking, to show that any claim you make about ultimate reality, it's just not going to hold up.
Oh, interesting. So he even critiques Dignaga's epistemology, right?
He does, yeah. Baba Viveka was using that to support his arguments, remember. But Candrakirti is skeptical of this whole idea that you can have these self-evident, indisputable foundations for your philosophical views.
Yeah, like how do you know those foundations are solid?
Exactly. And he points out that you can end up in an infinite regress.
Oh, right, where you need another foundation to support that foundation and so on and so on.
Exactly, yeah, never ends.
Or you run into the problem of self-validation.
Right, where the foundation is only valid because it says it's valid.
Circular reasoning.
Circular reasoning, exactly. So he's really challenging those dominant logical frameworks of his time.
Pretty radical.
Yeah, it's a radical critique. And he even extends that critique to the Yogacara school.
Oh, the Yogacara school, the mind-only school, right?
Exactly, yeah. And he actually thinks they have some good points. They shift the focus away from external objects as the source of suffering. But he says they make a mistake. They think consciousness itself is not empty.
Oh, so for Candrakirti, emptiness applies to everything, even the mind.
Everything, no exceptions. Even consciousness itself is dependently arisen. It's empty of inherent existence.
Gotcha. So what's Candrakirti's overall approach then? How does he think we should engage with the world if we can't really make any positive claims about it?
Well, he's really interesting here. He says we should take our ordinary experience, our conventional experience at face value. For practical purposes, we have to operate in the world.
Right. We have to use language. We have to interact with things.
Exactly. But he says we should always be aware that those underlying presuppositions we have, those beliefs in inherent existence, they're ultimately groundless.
So it's like we can play the game, but we shouldn't take it too seriously.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Like, don't get too attached to the rule.
Don't get caught up in the game.
Exactly.
So it's not about replacing those everyday beliefs with some, supposedly more accurate philosophical system.
No, not at all.
It's more about breaking this habit we have of clinging to any belief as inherently true.
Yeah. Like, loosen that grip.
Let go.
Let go.
Okay, so that's Candrakirti. Super interesting.
Super interesting.
Really pushes the boundaries of how we think about philosophy itself.
He does. He really does.
And then we have Shantideva coming onto the scene towards the end of the 7th century.
Right, right.
And he offers another crucial perspective on all of this.
He does.
And he's known for his work, the Bodhikarayavatara, right?
Yeah. The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life.
Which is really focused on ethics.
Right. Very much an ethical text.
But it also, it touches on those key Madhyamaka insights.
It does, yeah. It kind of brings together those philosophical and ethical dimensions.
Yeah. So he's not, coming up with totally new arguments, right?
No, no, no.
But he's really articulating those core Madhyamaka principles
Yeah.
in this, beautiful and persuasive way.
Yeah, he has a way of really driving the point home.
Yeah. Yeah, and our source points out his argument for universal compassion.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one.
Which, makes total sense in the context of Madhyamaka.
Right. Because